Good morning. I am Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on the migrant crisis in the U.S. Mexico border. I'm very happy to organize this with COMEXI, with the Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales. This webinar is being translated into Spanish. Let me give the floor to Nathan Wolf, the director of COMEXI, the Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, so he could introduce formally our three panelists. Please, Nathan, yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, all of you. It is a great honor to introduce our three panelists for today's webinar. Julia Preston is a journalist and contributing writer for the Marshall Project. Preston became a national correspondent covering immigration for the New York Times in April 2006. She was Times correspondent in Mexico from September 1995 to December 2001. She was a member of the New York Times staff that won the 1998 Pulitzer Prize for reporting on international affairs for its series that profiled the corrosive effects of drug corruption in Mexico. Preston is the author with Samuel Dillon of Opening Mexico, The Making of a Democracy, 2004, which recounts Mexico's transformation over 3 decades from an authoritarian state into a struggling democracy. Theresa Cardinal Brown. Theresa is BPC's Senior Advisor for Immigration and Border Policy. She came to BPC from her own consulting firm, Cardinal North Strategies, LLC. Brown was Director of Immigration and Border Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Associate Director of Business Immigration Advocacy at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and worked in immigration practices of large Washington, D.C.-based law firms. She was a policy advisor in the Office of the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and was on Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff's second stage review of USCIS. Erika Pinheiro. Erika administered federally funded high-volume immigration legal access programs in county jails and immigration detention facilities, housing adults and children. Erika helped create an all-volunteer legal orientation program for immigration detainees. As litigation and policy director of Direct Legal Services nonprofit Otro, Lado. Erika Pinheiro leads her organization efforts in filing cases, action lawsuits, challenging the Trump administration attacks on the U.S. asylum system, as well as slave labor practices and severe medical neglect in immigration detention facilities. Her team, has reunified dozens of separated families, including parents who were deported without their children, and has freed dozens of asylum seekers detained at the border. Before joining Al Otro Lado, Pinheiro administered one of the largest DACA programs in California, as well as representation programs for unaccompanied children. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today.
Thank you, Nathan. And let me share with all of you that I'm very proud and happy to have Julia, Theresa, and Erika with us. We have a top journalist, a top writer, and we have a top policy analyst, someone who knows Washington in and out, immigration policy. Thank you, Theresa. And Erika, who is a champion of human rights here in the U.S.-Mexico border. She works very hard in Tijuana and San Diego. Thank you, the three of you, for being with us. Let me start by saying that I believe that October 7, the terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel changed the world. We live in a more fragile world, and I don't have to tell you that the U.S.-Mexico border is basically connected with the well-being of the world. What happened in the spring last year? Well, there were a lot of Ukrainians and Russians coming into the U.S.-Mexico border. In April, May, since Turkey was having an election, there were a lot of Turkish people getting into our common border. So I'm sure the conflict in Gaza is going to have repercussions here in the border. But let me start with you, Julia. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you feel that this new and more fragile and violent war will affect the U.S.-Mexico border. But Julia, you just wrote a very important piece, a very important article in Foreign Affairs, which, by the way, has been translated for Foreign Affairs Latin America, so you should all read it. So could you share with us your argument, because you basically explained that it is the U.S. refugee and asylum system, which is explained in the current migration crisis. And Julia, thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Rafael. It's always a pleasure to speak with the people who follow the center. It does such important work. I believe that the crisis that we are facing at the U.S. Mexican border has a lot to do with a completely failing asylum system that is underlying many of the migration processes that are taking place. And when I say failing, broken, we talk about the broken immigration system in general, but the asylum system, in my view, is failing in all of its central purposes. It does not provide timely protection for people who need it, for migrants who need it. It's not providing timely denials to people who may have made terribly difficult and arduous journeys to get to the U.S. border, but cannot meet the narrow definitions that our asylum system, that structures the asylum system in the courts under current American law. It has created a very high degree of disorder at the border, and which is particularly dangerous for migrants who are stranded for one reason or another on the other side of the border. And most recently, it has impeded the transition of people who are caught in the asylum system into the labor market and into self-sufficiency that has long been a hallmark of the American immigration process, where people come to the country and they get to work and they are able to sort of take control to some degree of their own lives and move on. All of those processes are really failing under our current system. The system was designed in 1980. It was part of a refugee law that was created in the wake of World War II with Jewish refugees, Vietnamese refugees in mind. And the asylum system itself is a kind of a stepchild of the refugee process. And it was really conceived as a kind of, on a case-by-case basis to make decisions for what was thought at that time to be a small number of people who would come to the border and enter the United States before they had a vetting process or an asylum, a protection assessment process. What has happened is that this system has now become the de facto immigration system for the entire United States border, which was something that it really was never designed to do. And so the problem we have is that under the current law, you have at least under law, you have quite a wide opening at the border. The law says that people who reach American soil can make a claim for asylum, whether or not they crossed at a port of entry or in between a port of entry. That's what the law says. But from there, the process to actually get to an asylum adjudication and win protection in the United States is adversarial and very long. I was just looking at the figures. We now have we have 2.6 million cases in the immigration court backlog, the courts that will ultimately make the decision on many of these cases. And just in the last month, you had a record number of new cases, 180,000 new cases coming into the court system. So in New York City, which has been now the prime location where asylum seekers have been arriving, they're looking at court dates that are 4 years from as long as 5 years from now. So this is a system that is just not working. I want to make another point about this, which is not a popular point, but I really have to insist on making it, which is the way the asylum system has been functioning, especially along the length of the border that is defined by the river, by the Rio Grande River. the asylum process became a very lucrative and low risk opportunity for smugglers. And the whole smuggling system has proliferated on the backs of these most vulnerable people who are coming across Mexico through Central America, and now in an absolutely horrific transit across the Darien Gap, an area which we have to say, those of us who've ever been there or thought about it would never believe that people would try and get across that jungle. I mean, and so increasingly, in a moment when narcotic smuggling in Mexico has become increasingly dangerous and sort of disorganized, the narcotic smugglers have closed in as well on the human smuggling process and made it even more dangerous and difficult for migrants who are coming to the U.S. border and trying to get across. So that's just a very brief summation of how dysfunctional I think the system is. We're really looking at a systemic problem. This system really needs to be fixed. Unfortunately, we're looking at a Congress that can't even convene at the moment. So so the Biden administration is then coming up with some fixes that have the essentially what they're trying to do is just drive the asylum seekers away from the length of the border and through the ports of entry, and also dissuade people from coming by opening lawful opportunities in the sending countries. I'm sure Erika will have something to say about how well that's going.
Thank you, Julia. We'll go to Theresa and see if she could help us to understand this messy Washington, to say the least.
Messy is an understatement. I just want to say that I want to associate myself with just about everything.
Excuse me, Theresa.
Thank you.
Theresa. I wanted to say that for everybody, we have a Q&A button. Please send your questions either in English or in Spanish. We will, the panelists could see your questions, and Nathan will also read one of those questions. So we want to do this as interactive as possible. So use that Q&A button and send us your questions. Sorry, Theresa, go ahead, please.
That's quite all right. I was just saying that I want to associate myself with everything that Julia said. I think her diagnosis of what has happened and how it has essentially collapsed our existing asylum system is dead on. The challenge, though, is, as she mentions, that's the law. And Erika knows this very well because she's litigating over what the law says. But the law as it exists right now is creating, as you said, some chaos and very dangerous situations along the border. And I think it is time that we revisit some of this. Congress is the place to do it, in part because the efforts of this administration, even the last administration, and even the Obama administration, which is, I think, when we saw the beginnings of this fundamental shift in how the border operates and who is coming, have been they've attempted to do a lot of different things within what they believe is their authority under immigration law, but they've been challenged in court. And what that means essentially is that if Congress is not legislating, then in the executive branch is, putting things in place, then that ends up in litigation. And that results in, again, no matter what you believe about any individual policy, it results in extreme inconsistency in policy at the border. Some of these lawsuits are, by people who are looking out for the human rights of immigrants like Erika, and others are very politically driven lawsuits, I believe, but it doesn't really matter where they start. If a court comes in and says, stop what you're doing, and then the next court comes in and says, oh, you can continue what you're doing. And then another court comes in and says, no, you have to stop what you're doing, or you have to redo how you're doing it. That creates a lot of inconsistency. And I think that opens the border up to these criminal elements that are taking advantage of the system. It used to be for decades that most of the smuggling operations that brought migrants to the border were, we called them mom and pop operations when I was in CBP. Like, these were not very sophisticated criminal organizations. Many of them believed they were truly helping migrants achieve a better life. They thought they were doing it out of, yes, they were making some money, but mostly altruistic means. It was a means of survival for some of the families that were doing it along the border. That's not the case anymore. I think the majority of migrants that are engaging in smugglers that are now incorporated into these transnational criminal organizations and cartels, and they see it as another line of business, just like fentanyl, just like drugs, just like extortion and kidnapping, which oftentimes happens to the migrants after they are putting themselves in.
Yeah.
So there's so many ways in which what's happening right now is not good for anything. Rafa, you started your question about what does October 7th mean? I think something you said earlier bears repeating, right? The asylum system at the U.S. Mexico border is now attracting people from all over the world, more than 100 different countries of nationality. And as you said, when we see disruptions in other parts of the world, eventually that will show up in people coming to the U.S. Mexico border. So I do predict that we will see maybe Israelis, maybe Palestinians coming to the border and saying, I need protection because what's happening in our homes is not safe. And that will put further pressure on the systems at the border. And I think we need to recognize that is a fundamental difference, that whatever happens around the world, we will see come to the U.S. Mexico border right now. And I think that's a huge challenge for our asylum system as it exists. It's certainly a challenge to our capacity. One thing I will say, and I think this is very poorly understood in Washington and every place else, is that it really doesn't matter what our process is. If there are too many people arriving, then our capacity to exists, then the process goes out the window. Essentially, we have different regulations that have been put in place by this administration, other different kind of programs to try to manage things differently. But the reality is, when so many people are arriving in a short period of time in a particular location, then to keep people from being stuck, for example, between fences in San Diego or underneath bridges, the least resistance is we'll let them into the country, we'll have them figure out later in immigration court, which is just adding to that overwhelming backlog that Julia mentioned. To get back to what's happening in Washington, D.C., the challenge for Washington right now is that the dialogue that's happening, particularly in Congress about the border, is really not related to what's actually happening at the border. You have Republicans who primarily talk about going back to heavy deterrence and enforcement measures, building more sections of the wall, cutting off all asylum, and that's the way we're going to manage this. And I think that is not realistic. Certainly, walls and fences are not going to address this particular issue, primarily because most of the walls and fences are already on U.S. territory. And once you're in U.S. territory, you get to apply for asylum. But cutting off all asylum isn't the right answer either, because there are people deserving of our protection. And that is something that actually most Americans of all political persuasions agree on. So the conversation has to be more about how we do that. I do think on the other side, though, you have many Democrats who are trying to avoid the conversation altogether in many ways. They don't want to legislate on this, in part because they believe that negotiating with these hardline Republicans will just make the whole system worse. So even before what happened 16 days ago, when our first ever Speaker of the House was ousted, and we still do not have a Speaker in the House of Representatives, Congress was having a very hard time figuring out how to legislate any change here. And I don't think the current chaos in Washington is making that any easier.
Thank you, Theresa. Erika, let's go to you. You're in the front line of immigration. You're in Tijuana and in San Diego. Could you share with us your thoughts? I mean, how bad the situation is, how much suffering there is, and to what extent, I would say, the Biden administration has been an improvement from the Trump administration?
Well, first, just thank you so much for having me. And Julia and Theresa, your comments were super insightful. It's very rare that I agree with almost everything said on a panel. So thank you for being so knowledgeable about the border. So I cannot say that the Biden administration has been a huge improvement over the Trump administration. And the reason is because the Biden administration has tried to control the situation at the border through kind of a carrot and stick approach, right? Trying to open some legal pathways while increasing deterrence policies. And so there's two problems with this. One, when we talk about the legal pathways, they are extremely limited and do not address really the number of people who are arriving to the border. So I'll just give two very quick examples. One is CBP-1, which is an app that the government is using to process asylum seekers at the port of entry. And the numbers are very limited. Folks are waiting for months in Mexico trying to get an appointment. The app is glitchy, so some people can't even get to the screen where you make the appointment. And it's only available in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. So one of our panelists mentioned earlier that we have asylum seekers coming from over 100 countries. And so many of them are not even able to access the app and frankly don't want to wait in Mexico for the time it takes to obtain an appointment. The other parole programs really don't help people once they're already at the border, right? So there's certain parole programs for Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Ukrainians. All countries besides Ukrainians have a cap. Right. So we saw with the Ukrainians, there's no numerical limit on how many can take advantage of the parole program. And we saw the number of Ukrainians at the border disappear overnight. They really all are going through that parole program. With the other nationalities, in particular Venezuelans, the number of parole applications or parole appointments available to them, it just does not even begin to meet the need of, I think at this point, 7 million people who've left Venezuela and are headed to the border. So the legal pathways are just not large enough to really stop people from coming to the border. And they're just, again, not open to as many nationalities. And so what's happened is really this reliance on deterrence and putting all these resources into deterrence, again, not effective. We've seen both the Trump and Biden administrations really lean into these deterrence policies like family separation during the Trump administration. And like the year after family separation, we saw the highest number of families coming to the border to seek asylum. It really didn't work, right? And with the Biden administration, again, they're turning away people who do not have CBP-1 appointments from ports of entry and really driving them to cross between ports of entry, which is a subject of recent litigation that we filed. So to make it clear, the Biden administration is not following the law either. As I think Julia mentioned earlier, if you get to U.S. soil, I think both panelists mentioned, if you get to U.S. soil, you get to apply for asylum. If you approach a port of entry, you're supposed to be processed for asylum. But that's not happening, at least with respect to ports of entry. So we're creating this chaos really where people who normally would be processed in an orderly fashion at ports of entry, again, going between ports of entry, and currently we're seeing them being held in open air detention sites along the U.S. Mexico border. So this is basically a situation where, Border Patrol, whether it's true or not, and I'll get into that in a second, has a large number of people coming to the border and they're keeping them in like a pre-custody situation, according to them, where they are trapped between border walls or camped out in the desert for several days. They're not provided with adequate food, water, or medical care. And we're seeing, kids as young as breastfeeding children to elderly people with very serious medical issues, really suffering out there in these open air detention sites. And actually, we saw a woman from Guinea die last week in one of these sites in San Diego. And so all of these deterrence policies they've only made the border the most deadly land border crossing in the world for this past year. We've seen more deaths than ever before. Right. And some of them are in these situations where Border Patrol is sitting there watching people die, literally. So it's, I agree, it's chaos. Another issue is, just talking to thousands of migrants over the years, I would say very few of them understand that they have to apply for asylum when they get to the border. There's people who are fleeing persecution, economic hardship, all kinds of situations, environmental collapse in some of these countries. They're really thinking about coming for a better life for their families, whatever that means. And I would say even for people using CBP-1, very few of them understand that they have to apply for asylum once they get to the United States. So that's also clogging up those legal pathways. And then everybody else is just coming, between ports of entry. So I agree it's chaotic. I think, and just going back to this capacity issue, which I think Theresa mentioned, we have seen through numerous lawsuits that we filed that CBP and Border Patrol, both at ports of entry and between ports of entry, purposefully limit their capacity to limit the processing of asylum seekers, kind of going back to this political idea that if we just shut off asylum, people will be deterred and everything will be better, right? It doesn't work. It just results, like, for example, right now, what we're seeing in Border Patrol keeping people in essentially what are open air prisons on the border, which are life-threatening. And so last week, when that woman died, all of a sudden, everyone was processed. They cleared those camps within 24 hours, 48 hours. And so we see that the capacity to process is there. A lot of this chaos, I believe, is manufactured for political reasons, especially on the part of Border Patrol, which is a partisan, if you look at their union, partisan political organization. And so I think there's a lot more that the US government can do in following the law, processing people in an orderly way at ports of entry, and reducing these deterrence policies that do not deter people, but just lead to their deaths. I think with the situation in Israel, what's probably going to happen if we learn any lessons from the past, what we saw after the 9/11 attacks was just a complete militarization of the border, and a real focus on folks who are labeled as terrorists coming over the border. And so I think we'll probably see more of that. And it would not surprise me to see both Israelis and Palestinians arriving to the border, because as we've mentioned, it's a very diverse population of folks coming, which I think is different from how most people perceive asylum seekers.
Thank you, Erika. It's a wonderful explanation, and thank you for sharing what's going on in the front line, which is the U.S. Mexico border. Nathan, there's quite a few questions. Could you read some of them? And also, Theresa and Julia, I would like to talk about, just something that Erika was already signaling, that is, apparently there's going to be much more enforcement in the coming days and months. Biden asked yesterday Congress for quite a big amount of money to enforce the border. So let's talk about that, but let's listen to some of the questions that Nathan has to share with us. Please, Nathan.
Sure. Some of them were already answered by our panelists, but I will try to put some of them together as well. David Calderon, it seems to exist a paradigm in both Mexico and the US with the current unemployment rates in low levels and private companies, especially those located in the Mexico northern border, having a hard time to find labor. Do you believe that nowadays politicians simply don't want to use their political capital to negotiate a migrant reform in both countries? And together, in the same sense, David Edick Jr., what might a functional and effective U.S. migration and asylum system look like? Are there any existing immigration systems in the world that offer a useful model?
And there's one out there that I would like to mention. It's if you expect any good happenings or conclusions from this coming summit in I believe it's going to be in Palenque, in the south of Mexico. President López Obrador invited quite a few Latin American presidents, among them Maduro. So it will be important. And the idea is to have some talking and some dialogue about, how to put some order. Let's go to you, Julia, and see what you think, your thoughts, and then we'll go to Theresa and Erika, and we will continue to read to you the questions that have been sent to us by the people listening and watching this webinar. Julia, please.
So there are a lot of questions there, including how do we fix the whole system? So I just want to note, and maybe Theresa will also elaborate on this, about October 7th. In the package that the president requested last night, there is as much money for the border and for immigration as there is for Israel. It's $14 billion he's requesting. And so two things happened there. One is the administration immediately brought these issues together, the U.S. border and Israel and Ukraine. I will also point out that in the past week, the United States proceeded to implement a program that will allow Israeli citizens to come to the United States without a visa. So in case we were wondering about the political selectivity of our immigration process, you only have to look at that. I mean, that was a negotiation that was in place for a long time and was actually completed just before October 7th happened. But nevertheless, the administration did go ahead and put that, it's called a visa waiver. So now Israeli citizens will be able to, after a vetting process, come to the United States actually without a visa, which is in the current situation, something to think about. I mean, part of the problem that we have at the border is that I think it's fair to say that the large majority of people who are coming to the border are engaging in some fashion with the asylum system, but what they really want is to work. They want to have they want, as Erika said, they want the better life that the United States economy is actually prepared to offer, because we have a huge economic expansion going on. We have 3% unemployment, particularly in the areas that traditionally immigrant workers have entered into and begun the process of rising up in this country. Far more home health care, factory, food processing. There's a lot of demand out there. What we don't have is any efficient system for allowing those people who do not have strong claims to protection, but do have work skills to offer and incredible motivation to offer them. We don't have in terms of the border, we have no system. There is no line for those folks. We can talk about the H-2A program and the H-2B program, and those things have grown in recent years pretty dramatically, actually. But it has not had, we do not have a way to articulate labor migration at the border.
Well, I'll just kind of come on that. One thing that's very important to understand about our immigration system that I think many Americans and probably most of the immigrants may understand it better than anybody else. It's almost impossible to come to the United States legally unless you already have a sponsor in the United States. Our system is designed that you must have someone in the United States who is asking the government to let you come, either as a family relationship or as an employer. There are very small categories in which you can kind of self-petition. And that's true for most temporary visas as well as permanent visas, particularly any visa that that enables you to work. So the challenge for immigrants who want to come and work is they don't have a sponsor already that can sponsor them in a job. And it is an inefficient process, even if you can. We have seen some increases in the use of those visas, particularly H-2A, which is temporary agricultural work. But historically, those temporary visas, particularly work visas, have been, I won't say monopolized, but the vast majority of workers who come on those visas are from Mexico. So the recruitment systems, the employers in the United States who are looking to recruit workers under those programs, for the most part, know how to recruit and hire people from Mexico. They don't have the same networks that would allow them to recruit from Central America or South America, or let alone as far away as Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which are countries that are coming to the border too. So like there's, we talk about the system that's not really meeting the moment or the needs. That's another reason why it's not. So that's one of the reasons why there's a push right now for those who have already been let into the country to, at some point, presumably pursue asylum, to let them have work authorization after they arrive. That's a great concept, but our immigration system is backlogged in providing work authorization to people right now too. So like every part of the system is just overwhelmed by numbers at the moment. And I think that's a big challenge. I also want to talk a little bit about Mexico's role here. Erika mentioned these parole programs for Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti are numerically limited. And one of the reasons they were numerically limited was because the Biden administration was negotiating that Mexico would take back into Mexican territory those that were essentially deported from the United States, first under Title 42, but now under our immigration law, since until recently, those are countries that we could not easily deport people back to. And they were a significant number of arrivals at the border. So it was agreed essentially that Mexico would take back as many people as we would open up slots for parole for. And so Mexico's role really in addressing the situation at the border, in many, many ways, the United States is dependent on Mexico, not just whether or not Mexico will allow migrants come through its territory to the border. And Mexico has had a history of sort of mixed policies with regard to people migrating through Mexico to the U.S. Mexico border. Some points in time, they have said, well, we'll give you work authorization. Some points in time said, we'll require you to have a temporary transit visa. Other points in time said, no, we're going to keep you in southern Mexico and make you apply for asylum here until we don't. So I think Mexico's own policies about the migrants coming through Mexico have been mixed, and that's also been part of the issue. But increasingly, because this is a migration coming throughout the hemisphere, Julia mentioned how many migrants are coming from South America up through the Darien Gap. This really has to be dealt with in a foreign policy way. And I think the United States tried to do a lot of that in some of the Americas with the Los Angeles Declaration 2 years ago. We're now seeing sort of some of the fruit of that agreement with like the safe mobility offices that the United States is negotiating in certain countries. Yes, Mexico is pulling together this summit to try to talk to other countries about how jointly countries can manage migration. I saw there was a question in the Q&A about international organizations like IOM and UNHCR, and they are absolutely involved in this. Because many of these countries don't have sufficient capacity in their own asylum or refugee programs, and so are relying on these international organizations that, by the way, the US is the major funder for. So like we're continuing to help in that way too. So part of this is going to be, what can we do so that it's not just all about get to the US border no matter how. I mean, the migrants are desperate. That's what they have in their mind is necessary. If I get to the border, if I get to the United States, I will be safe. My family is be safe. Exactly as Erika said, this is a level of desperation that we have not, I think, previously seen in these numbers at our border. And so traditional strategies of prevention and deterrence and harsh punishments are really ineffective. But what we do need to look at is, how do we get to migrants where they are or where they start from and provide them alternatives if possible, certainly provide them with education as to what it means to try to enter the United States, what the legal requirements are before they embark. Because once they're at the border, they're not going back. They're not. They will find a way to come to the United States.
Thank you, Theresa. Erika, I wonder if you could give us a sense of, how it feels in the border. What is, how do you see Mexico's role in trying to order this chaotic border, and what is your take about the coming, what I would say, enforcement measures by the Biden administration?
Well, just first reflecting on some of the comments that my co-panelists made. When we're talking to migrants who are already at the border, they overwhelmingly want to do things the right way, right? So when we're actually speaking with them, they want to enter through a port of entry. If the parole programs are available to them, they want to do that. And so I think if we did have a functioning system where people could apply for a work permit, apply to enter the United States to enter the labor market essentially and be vetted, I think people would be willing to wait for that. However, because of the militarization of the border and how difficult it is to cross, organized crime has been supercharged at the border. I mean, I would say over the past few years that I've been living in Tijuana, each year is more violent than the last. You know, each year is more dangerous than the last. I think just last week in my neighborhood, there were narcomantas, right? These messages from the cartels hanging everywhere when we went outside the house. And that's something that I didn't see even a few years ago. And so I don't think it's safe for many people to wait. Like once they're at the border, they're kind of in a situation where they have to move on. And so even if we have these legal pathways open, it's just not safe for people to wait. And I think also when people are engaged with the higher level of smuggler that are tied to cartels, they don't have a choice. You know, they have an itinerary, they're being brought, especially the extracontinental migrants, which we're seeing in much larger numbers right now. They have an itinerary from the time they leave their country to the time they cross the border, and that is not under their control. And so that's just something to think about when we talk about agency for migrants. You know, what's going to make them decide one way or another. In many cases, they just don't have a choice if they're engaging with these high-level criminal organizations from the inception of their journey. And we see that in the number of murders of migrants that have happened even along the California-Mexico border in the past few weeks. And so with respect to Mexico, another thing we've seen during the AMLO administration is the creation and expansion of the National Guard, essentially guarding the U.S. border from the Mexican side. And it has completely militarized our lives in the border region. You know, when I'm going from home to work in Tijuana, I have to cross through checkpoints. Anyone who's been on that side of the border has seen the soldiers driving in their trucks. And it's just ubiquitous at this point. And it really changes the tenor of what it's like to live in the border region and makes it feel like we're in a war zone, essentially. And we are in many senses, we are in a war zone, just given the level of violence. And so with Mexico, it's a really tricky situation. Obviously, Mexico has the ability to control migration flows to a great extent, like some of the recent policies that my co-panelists mentioned of keeping people in Tapachula so that they can't advance north, or at the beginning of the AMLO administration when they were giving basically humanitarian visas to the caravans that were coming through and trying to encourage them to stay in Mexico and work. So I think official Mexican policy does, to a great extent, influence migration and the number of migrants who can reach the border, but to a great extent it can't because of the strength of organized crime, right? Like I just mentioned. And so I don't know what the answer is. The other issue is the corruption we're seeing from the Mexican government. I know that in Tamaulipas, there was a case of Mexican immigration officials and police murdering a large group of migrants, and we've seen that in other places along the border. And I can tell you from speaking to the migrants themselves that even the National Guard will extort them and beat them. And, you know, there's all of these issues of people being extorted by Mexican law enforcement as they're crossing Mexican territory. So it's a very complex issue in terms of Mexico's role. What I will say that's very interesting about Mexico is because they respect the Cartagena Declaration, that folks can get asylum in Mexico for general conditions in their country, whereas in the United States, they cannot. And so with respect to Central Americans in particular, we see a much higher percentage of asylum approvals in Mexico than we do in the United States. And for many of those people, it's probably in their best interest to stay in Mexico. And that's something that we definitely talk to people about when they come to our office. And many people do end up staying. The issue is really the lack of investment in Mexico's asylum system. They've invested, probably, I don't know if it's billions at this point, but definitely millions of dollars in the National Guard. And I believe the last time I saw Comar's budget, which is the Mexican Asylum Agency, it was less than the budget of my nonprofit organization for the entire country. So that is, not going to encourage people to stay. And we've seen in Tapachula in particular, that also referred to as an open air prison because people are, in the past have been forced to apply for asylum there and then not able to leave, right? So I think if we wanted to really improve the situation, the first thing I would say is an investment in Mexico's asylum system. The other issues I unfortunately don't have the answer for. They are very complex, but we cannot deny Mexico's very close relationship with the United States in controlling migration flows from its southern border to the U.S. Mexico border.
Thank you, Erika. Nathan, I wondered if you could read some more questions. And I must say, Erika, I believe that we Mexicans, Mexico doesn't have an immigration vision. We're basically reacting to what's happening in the terrain. We're reacting to some U.S. Initiatives, but we don't really have a medium, long-term vision of immigration, so that doesn't help. Nathan,
I'll just say, I don't think the United States does either.
Okay.
It's not only Mexico. You know, I answered somebody's question in the Q&A asking about sort of what's the short-term, medium, long-term role. I think the part of the problem is that there's not been an articulation by this administration, certainly, or by Democrats, of what they think, if they don't agree with what the Republicans are proposing, which they don't, of what their alternative vision is. I think the Biden administration tried to do that back in the springtime when Title 42 was taken down, this carrot and sticks approach in general, yes, series of policies, but they keep saying, oh, Congress, we need you to pass comprehensive immigration reform. That's like, Congress, we need you to make the sky purple. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen right now. Yes, we'd love to see that. It's not going to happen. So what exactly would they need Congress to change? And they're not saying that. And so that's resulted in nobody really saying, like, hey, here's the structure of what we think can work, or even a place to start that conversation. And unfortunately, that means that more people that Erika is speaking to are just caught up in this kind of continual not doing anything.
Thank you, Theresa. Nathan, if you could read us some questions. And
yeah, sure.
And
we have plenty of them. We do have the diagnosis, but it's hard to find the solution. How do we fix the migration crisis? Quick answer, quick question, not that easy answer. Why is the number of desperate people unprecedented right now?
Julia, before I give you the floor, and we have 10 more minutes to go, so this will be perhaps your last comment. But Julia, you're in New York City, and I believe, I mean, right, you've seen the results of Governor Abbott from Texas. I mean, bossing the migrants there. So could you tell us a little bit of that? Because apparently Abbott has been extremely successful in making Democrats to react and say, sorry, I cannot handle so many immigrants. So could you share with us your thoughts about that, about this Abbott policy, and how successful he was in really changing the debate? And so why don't we go to Julia, Julia, then to Erika, because I know she has to go, and then we'll finish with you, Theresa. Let's make the last remarks. And if you could try to give us an insight, I mean, how would you fix the system? Because we know very hard times lie ahead. We're having elections next year in the U.S. and in Mexico, and this is going to be a big issue in the election. Please, Julia. And thanks.
Well, I was going to say, if you know, to not have this be too grim a panorama here, that one of the perhaps positive dynamics that has been created over the last year or so is the engagement now of Democratic politicians at city and state level in understanding how broken the system is. And so there's a potential political momentum there. It's very hard to see where it would lead, but it's something new in immigration politics. And that's essentially happened because, as you mentioned, I mean, I see this as a kind of in a different way than I think people see it from the border. I mean, essentially what Governor Abbott did was create a transit system for tens of thousands of migrants who already were not planning to stay in the borderlands. He's gotten the Texas taxpayers to pay for people to go to Chicago, to Los Angeles, but mainly to New York, and to a lesser extent to Washington and to Florida. This is the difference with what, and to be clear, and I think that Erika will confirm this, Humanitarian organizations are also participating to some degree in the process of helping people get on buses and get out of the borderlands if they have a place to go. What Governor Abbott has done, and he's not he's not the only person that is engaged in busing out of the borderlands, but what he's done is kind of supplant what the federal government should be doing. He's sending people to places where he can taunt the local Democratic mayors and governors and say, with this kind of political gambit, which has been, as you point out, remarkably successful, to say, you know, we've been dealing with this, with these numbers in our states for many years now. Now you deal with it. I will point out that the city of New York, the mayor of New York has been very vociferous and kind of abrasive in his commentary, but the city of New York today is providing shelter in hotels and quite actually reasonable facilities for over 60,000 migrants. This has happened because New York, among an exception among all the cities in the country, has a shelter mandate. So the city government must provide shelter for these people. The mayor of New York has become very aggravated about this because he has had no support or very little support from the federal government for these shelter processes. But in fact, the city of New York has done something very dramatic in terms of welcoming people, giving them a place to stay, getting their kids into school. Behind the abrasive rhetoric of the mayor is actually a extraordinary process of welcoming that continues to this day. The city of New York, and now we have Chicago, you not only have the mayor of Chicago, now you have the governor, who's one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. You have Governor Kathy Hochul of New York, Governor Maura Healey. So now suddenly you have state level and city level, very powerful Democrats who are engaged in this process. So will that change the dynamic? Will that create some kind of resettlement, more coherent resettlement system, take the process out of the hands of the governor of Texas and with the federal government making better decisions about where migrants could go and help them get there? I don't know, but that's one of the possibilities. And I don't know, does anyone want to talk about Venezuela and what's going on in Venezuela? We had such a dramatic example of the contradictions of, the Biden administration just trying whatever they can get. On one hand, you have TPS for Venezuelans based on the fact that they can't go back, which was essentially an effort to get those Venezuelan people to respond to this pressure from the mayor of New York and these local level politicians to get people into the labor market, to give them work authorization more quickly. Basically in the same time frame that you have the administration initiating formal deportations back to Venezuela in the same week. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but this is what they're doing to try and
I will say that
crazy system together.
The immigration system is nothing if not contradictory.
Right.
And I would say that is example A of an administration that does not have a unified vision, that does not, because they are literally reacting constantly to whatever the latest, public political problem is. And so, they, again, the carrot and stick approach, like, okay, we will answer the call from the Democratic mayors and governors of these cities to get people work authorization. But at the same time, more Venezuelans are coming to the border. So we want to let them know that they're not necessarily going to be able to get into the country and get that work authorization, right? So like, I don't necessarily disagree that there has to be carrots and sticks, that I think policy requires that, but the ham-fisted way that it's been done, and the fact that it's so obvious that there's not that these are diametrically opposed statements, is so hard to kind of wrap your head around.
Erika, you want to say something? I know you have to go, and we all have to go, but tell us your last comments.
I was in this discussion about New York, just reflecting on the last few weeks in San Diego, where the state has actually defunded our respite shelters, which would do that job of moving people to their sponsors throughout the United States. And we've seen about 800 to 1,000 migrants just dropped on the streets of San Diego every day. And so the nonprofits have come together to create an ad hoc welcoming system. I'm happy to announce that the County of San Diego has invested $3 million in making the system a little bit more sustainable. But I think one huge misconception about the border and what makes Governor Abbott's actions particularly disingenuous is that it's about 99% of people who do not stay in the border region, and the vast majority of them do have the resources to move on, and they do have someone in the United States to receive them. The issue is that, that 1%, they go to New York because it's the only place that has created a real sustained welcoming system because of that right to shelter. And something that we've discussed previously in this panel, which is the most important thing, is giving people the right to work immediately. And I can tell you from talking to these asylum seekers, most of them that I've talked to are educated, or they have a particular skill that is very needed in the US labor market, and they would be self-sufficient within a number of weeks, I would say, if they were given the opportunity to work right away. And so when we're talking about fixes for the chaos at the border and the chaos in our immigration system, I think that's one of the first things that we need to think about.
Thank you, Erika. Nathan, you have the last words. It's one. We have 1 minute left, and it's been a wonderful. We cover a lot. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Theresa. And it's been wonderful. We know this is hard to solve. Harsh times are coming, but yours is the floor, Nathan.
Thank you so much. And the people that listen to us say the same. They were really thrilling about your comments, about your participations, and they ask us to continue these webinars with these topics. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks a
for
lot.
inviting us.
And to be continued, because this is something that won't, will stay here with us. And thank you again, Julia. Thank you again, Theresa. And thank you, Erika. Thank you, Nathan. We'll see you next month. We will see you the second Friday of November. And thank you all for being here. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Gracias a todos.
Hasta
Un
luego.
abrazo.